Hi, Liz. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Eric.
So, this is a very exciting episode for me, listeners, because Liz is a art and cultural historian, an author, and a speaker. And she just wrote a book called Beyond Vanity, The History and Power of Hairdressing. So before we started recording, I was telling Liz that I am a fan of hair history. Not that I know anything about it, but I think it's great that we have a history in the hair industry. And it's always been very curious to me how little any of us in the hair industry have paid attention to the history of our industry. But you may or may not know, Liz, that one time in the distant past, although you're a historian, so this is not so distant for you, but in distant my past, I did an episode of the Hair Game podcast called The History of Hair, Trivia, and Fun Facts.
Cool. I need to look this episode up.
It's actually quite funny. I was really afraid that the episode was going to be boring. So I sat down with one of our Salon Republic beauty professionals named Dossie. And Dossie is pure comedy, just like the best personality. And so we sat down and I did a little research. I actually spent hours on it. So I'm curious to see if any of our research actually meshes. Yours is real research. I just did a quick cursory search on the internet and found some very interesting historical things about hair. And we talked about those on the podcast. Dossie hadn't heard of any of them. So she was kind of making fun of it like in real time. And so it was very, very entertaining. It's called The History of Hair, Trivia, and Fun Facts. Listeners, I'll put the link to that old episode in there. It's definitely worth a listen. We had so much fun. So anyway, that's a brief little summation of how excited I am to talk to you about your book, which covers the history and power of hairdressing. And I'm going to stop there and I'm going to let you say something because I've been blabbering.
Thank you. I love how there's an episode for us to catch up on, and I want to hear those little bits and pieces of trivia that you covered. My book, Beyond Vanity, The History and Power of Hairdressing, is my latest work, and it covers my passion period of history, which is the United States from the mid 19th century to the late 19th century. So after the Civil War, 1865 to about 1900, because this is when I think that the hair industry really explodes onto the scene.
Very, very interesting. Okay, so this book has been written up in all the major publications. This is not a little thing. This is a big thing. New York Post, Town and Country, Elle Magazine, and just the entire gamut. BBC did a blurb on it. Forbes Magazine wrote, in addition to a lot of fascinating stories and some truly frightening 19th century technology, the book is also an argument for the study of hair as related but separate from fashion. And absolutely, that is an accurate summation of this industry that we're in. Our industry is often thought of as kind of on the fringe of things, yet every person in society is really part of it. I mean, everyone goes to a salon, gets their hair at least cut, every once in a while, if not regularly. But yet in our industry, we often think of ourselves kind of on the fringes and in this kind of very unique, niche, if you will.
It's so fascinating for me to hear your perspective on it, because from the historian's perspective, that's exactly like how I see it, but that there's so much myth busting to do. And if I can provide like this historical basis for this incredible profession that, as you say, like touches all of our lives. I mean, my relationship with my hairdresser, who's also, he cuts and colors my hair, is like, going on to, I think, 2 decades now. It's one of the most important relationships in my life. And I think everyone can relate to that aspect of hairdressing and taking care of our own hair, and then wringing our hands because we can't do it as well as our hairdresser can. And so because I specialize in 19th century women's history, my first book was on women's fashion in the late 19th century and how women in the United States who had the money were going to France to buy the best of the best silk couture dresses. And related to that, you can't do fashion history without studying all of the other aspects of the beauty industry that correlate to the fashion industry. So that's really where my research really began to get deeper and deeper into the hairdressing industry. Was I was looking at how close the relationships were between fashion designers, hairdressers, hat makers. This all worked together. I mean, you couldn't walk out of the house as a middle-class woman or an upper-class woman in the 19th century without having your hair properly done. You just couldn't. So you could have as beautiful a dress on, an ensemble and fur coat and fur-lined carriage boots as you wanted, but you weren't leaving the house unless your hair was done.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so now you made mention of the class that was able to engage in fashion and things like that. I'm also kind of curious on just kind of as it relates to kind of the everyday woman. What is that the same for them? But were they able to leave the house, so to speak, without doing their hair?
Right. So it is a little different depending on class, race, and I cover that all of that in the book. So the book discusses women of multiple different classes and ethnic backgrounds. So Black women, mixed race women, white women, middle class, upper class women, and then like the top like 0.01% of society in the major cities like New York and Chicago. So the services that were available to women of different classes, it did differ, but for the most part, the middle and upper class women were mostly doing their hair at home, and they were either, if you were middle class, you were probably doing your hair, cleaning your hair and styling your hair with the help of a friend or a sister or a mother. If you had the means, then you would have a lady's maid. So upper class women would have a lady's maid at home who was one of the main roles of their position was to style the woman's hair. So you see these advertisements in magazines and newspapers at the moment of the time when ladies' maids were putting out ads. If they were out of work, they would take out an ad saying, "I'm available for work." Or you'd have an upper class manager of a home putting out an ad for a lady's maid. And one of the main responsibilities was, it would say, like, must know how to dress hair well. And so that was one of the major roles, because if you had a lady's maid, they needed to be able to not only clean your hair, help you shampoo your hair, because at the time, the ideal for white women's hair was to be long, luxurious, wavy, usually brown, and to be able to have those long locks so that you could style it up into like what they would call an abundant updo, so just like a lot of like mass. And to be able to like braid it and swirl it, and sometimes you would put like a jeweled crescent in your hair, or a jeweled comb, or even like these strings of pearls, just really beautiful styles that were impossible to do by yourself.
Utterly fascinating. And I'm going into all different directions inside my head right now with the questions to ask. Oftentimes when I'm watching a period movie that is set within that range of time, the mid 19th century, let's say post Civil War, like you said, I often think as I'm watching scenes, recognizing that not everybody had plumbing, right? Is that when did plumbing, now in major cities, New York City, Manhattan, maybe there was internal plumbing like we know it today, but in many places there wasn't plumbing, right? There was a well.
Yeah, I love how you brought up plumbing, because I often say that like when you get into 19th century history, you get into these little like quirky corners, and one of them is plumbing history, and it's like really fascinating. So when I started looking into hairdressing history, I had to start with France because France sets the style both with couture and with hairdressing. I mean, the history there goes back into the 1700s and continues on. And in the 19th century, I was looking at newspaper images, which are so rare, but newspaper images of high-end salons. This is like 1890s when they could really get some good imagery into the newspapers of a salon that had just been refurbished. And it was boasting, just so proud of the fact that it had running water so that the hairdresser could wash the client's hair in the shampoo bowl. Now, the difference from today is that the shampoo bowl was in the front. So you had the client seated, the shampoo bowl was in the front of them, and then they're like flipping over their hair, and it's getting washed that way, and the hairdresser's standing behind you. So that's one difference. But in this French salon, the owner was called Lentaric. He is advertising that he can do shampooing in his salon in the French style and in the American style. So what does that mean? The American style was au courant, and that meant he had the means to have running water. So he had outfitted his older, European French buildings are older than in the United States, but he had it outfitted for running water into the sink. And so the American style was to wash your hair with water and shampoo, based on the fact that in the United States, buildings were newer and had the plumbing. The French style was essentially, and what he was pitching, it's a little less expensive than the wet style, but it was essentially dry shampoo that we have today. It was powder, and you would comb the powder into your hair, and it would absorb dirt and oil.
Fascinating. So that was not a new invention when dry shampoo was all the rage starting a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and it's called dry shampoo in that time, the same way it is today. Like a lot of the products.
That's really funny.
Yeah, a lot of the products at the time had different. They sound sort of old timey, like they were called restorers or invigorators. And then you start to get the words like shampoo, and there were pomades. But dry shampoo was called dry shampoo.
That's utterly fascinating. And, the other thing that I think about when I see things, it's a little bit more obvious in the movies or the TV shows that deal with that period, is electricity, of course. Yes. Electricity, we didn't always have electricity. There was a point at which, all of a sudden, there's a point at which we didn't have it. And when the sun went down, you had to light candles or lamps, that burned kerosene and other things. And then all of a sudden we started having, electricity, and maybe you could be in the salon later on, right? But with the plumbing thing, I always am watching the scene, and I'm like, I bet the people really smell like, body odor, right? I mean, you probably didn't have deodorants the same way, and I doubt that most kind of common people washed every day, and so hair is very much part of our bodies, and so I just, all of it has always been fascinating to me. So I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, so, and I want to hear more anecdotes, but first tell us, how long did you research this book, and tell us about how you researched.
Okay, so I have a PhD in art history, and my area of focus was late 19th century American painting. So John Singer Sargent, Mary Cassatt, Winslow Homer, and my area of focus was on portraiture of women, so images of women. And I became really interested in the women's hairstyles as they were portrayed on the canvas, so like huge portraits in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I was really looking closely at hairstyles and also hair color. So my dissertation for the PhD was on representations of women's hairstyles in paintings. So that goes back a number of years. Then I paused from the hair research because I think I needed a break from it, went into the fashion history research, and then circled back to the hair research. So overall, I know it sounds kind of nuts, but probably started the hair research 15 years ago. The work for this book, Beyond Vanity, came together in the course of 3 years.
Got it. And that was kind of you probably had intensive research where you went into libraries and looked for, like, did they still have microfiche? Like I grew up
Thank
in
goodness.
microfiche
I know.
times.
So thank goodness, no. The microfiche is, I mean, there's still some of it around, but gradually, so many of these sources are becoming digitized, which is, I mean, it makes all the difference. But every once in a while, I still have to dig into some microfilm. And that's the one that, like, if you remember from like grade school, it's like on these rolls and you have to, and then it's like connected to a screen and it's a nightmare. But digitize, I mean, power to all these libraries across the country that are digitizing old newspapers, because I was able to see some hairdressing trade journals online, very, very few. But then the moment of like the most like rewarding, incredible research moment was when I got to go to the library at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York and actually sit at a table with 4 volumes of American Hairdresser journal. And it was called a journal, but it was on newspaper, and it's like brittle. I'll never forget sitting at the table and like slowly turning the pages. The corners are brittle. It's fairly yellowed, but this was the trade magazine that American hairdressers were writing to each other in and corresponding to each other in, and like bringing up questions of like price fixing and, you know, so-and-so is charging too much for their shampoos. This really needs to come down to 35 cents. And
Oh my gosh.
I know.
And what years were the volumes that you're reading?
The volumes I was reading were late 1880s and early
Wow.
1890s. Yeah.
And that's that's an American publication, right?
Yes.
And was it focused on a specific geography, New York City?
It was for the hairdressers across the country. So it's a lot of people writing, like the board members, you know, like the masthead is hairdressers in New York and Chicago. Chicago had the first hairdressing academy. So you can say that hairdressing professionalized in the United States in the late 1870s into the 1880s. And the first trade journal comes out of Chicago as well. But then New York is always big on, you know, communication and printing and technology. So New York comes in and is producing the journal as well. So the practitioners are writing in from major cities all over and small towns all over the country. And what I find fascinating is that even though the masthead is all men's names, male hairdressers, there's women who are writing in and doing like opinion columns, and then you have kind of like there's a lot of like complaining that's coming in from hairdressers across the country, and it's, you know, those are women practitioners too. And then there's like this rivalry between the barbers and the hairdressers, and, you know, a lot with pricing.
All the way back then?
Oh, yes.
Oh my God. So you're telling me nothing's changed?
Nothing's changed. I think more has stayed the same from what I understand from professionals that I talk to today.
Okay. So I'm fascinated to hear what some of the complaining was about.
Complaining about it really is mostly that pricing. So you would charge like more for a cut than for a shampoo, but it was just like people were so concerned with like this price of shampooing, say in the 1880, from going from 35 cents to 50 cents. We should look up the conversion rate to today, but, you know, it sounds small, but it must have made a huge difference. And, you know, as with today, like the economy
That's like a 40% increase.
Yeah, right. So yeah. So people were like, you know, you got to tone it down. And they would like call people out. They would say like the name of the person who was charging too much, and that it was really...
People do that now.
Okay.
Except we have this thing called Instagram.
Yeah, right. Oh my gosh. I love this. It's so similar.
Fascinating.
And then there is this, like, I mean, it's not all negative by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, there's really like sharing of information going on, especially sharing recipes for shampoos. So they were called receipts, which is just a version of the word recipe. And for these shampoos at the time, the most frequent one that I see come up in the trade journals and then also in the advice manuals and in etiquette manuals that were going to women's homes were recipes for egg yolk shampoos, which I
Gross.
understand, like, yeah, like that makes when I mention that, like, it sounds crazy to like, me and my husband were like, egg yolk shampoo, how would you get that out? And what was the goal? But then when I mention it to hairdressers, it kind of like locks in as making sense, I guess. Like there's
Yeah.
mayonnaise type shampoos that are on the market, I guess, today. Is that right?
Well, I know that there's certain elements of what you get in a yolk or mayonnaise. There's oils, moisturizing components. So I understand it, but still, it's kind of
Yeah.
gross
You understand.
to think
Yeah.
about.
So I think they must have been going after like glossiness and then I guess the protein in the egg yolk or something. But then in the like recipe it'll say like get it into a froth, so basically a lather, but I don't understand that either because they're saying to not use the whites and I like wouldn't the whites be what would do the frothing? I don't really know.
So when did the first products, kind of mass-produced products, come out? And was it the names that we know of today? L'Oreal and
Yeah, I
Estee
think
Lauder.
L'Oreal
Maybe Estee Lauder is like the mid 20th century, I think.
mid 20th. Yeah, so L'Oreal really is the earliest that we see come in the early 20th century for manufactured products as we know them today. But in the period that I look at so closely, like we're talking 1870s, 80s, 90s, and then especially like right at the turn of the century at 1900, there's just an explosion of products on the market. And they start off kind of like hand mixed in hairdressers' kitchens and they're selling them in their salons. I mean, again, like so much of this is relatable. But you have, I have one hero of the book. I call her Christiana Carto Bannister, who's working in Boston and Providence. So Boston, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island. She's of African American and Native American descent, and she's mixing products in her kitchen. Then she opens up early versions of hair salons, which she called them hair rooms, which is a phrase that you see fairly often. Another early form of salons are called saloons, so just like a gathering place.
Okay.
And so she has hair rooms, which are basically rooms that she rented in a walk-up building in Boston and then in Providence. She's going between two different cities. She has clients in two different cities, and she has products that she's selling in two different cities, like two different across state lines. And her
That's
products
huge.
are, I know, her products are like a restorer and she calls it a restorer, but it's made with tree bark and herbs from the forest. Like, I mean, all in on the advertising here. And the ingredients for hers are difficult to get at for a number of like researchy reasons. But there are other products that are known from newspapers and from advertisements where there's actual bottles that still exist and the labels are still affixed to them. So I've seen some of those and can get a sense of what the ingredients were. And it's mostly alcohol. So it's like
It's
70% alcohol.
Oh my God.
Yeah, not so moisturizing, I guess.
Right.
And so someday, maybe I'll be able to find more examples and see what some of the more serum-y oil, ingredients were. But for the most part, the ones that I see, there's one called Seven Sutherland Sisters. They were basically seven sisters with extremely long, dark, wavy hair, down to their ankles, essentially. And they toured the country, and they were also singers. And anyway, they went around with the circus. But they're some of the best known women from the period who worked in hair, and their products are everywhere. And there's some bottles that still exist.
That is so interesting. Okay, so I know when I was I don't even want to call it research. When I just quickly went on the internet to look up some interesting things to talk about. Well, I guess,
counts.
But it demeans what you did by calling it research because it was not real research. I don't remember details, but there was a point in the early 20th century. Well, we'll start back when you were doing the late 19th century, early 20th century, when still it was a unique thing to go to a salon. right? I mean, now just about everybody goes to a salon, but that was not a commonplace that long ago. When did it become more commonplace for
Right.
just about everybody to go to a salon or barbershop?
So the modern concept of like a beauty parlor comes in the early 20th century, and certainly by like the 1920s and 1930s that is firmly in place. Earlier, this is the period, and this is what I love about this period so much, is that the industry is just coming on the scene, like it's just burgeoning. So yes, home hair care is the norm. And like I said, so middle class, upper class, doing your hair at home with like a friend, a mother, a sister, or having your lady's maid. If you were like Caroline Astor or Alva Vanderbilt and had all the money in the world, then you could hire like the fanciest French hairdresser in town, who would be a man. So in New York City, there were male French hairdressers who had, all the cachet of being trained in France, or they claimed to. And it's unclear whether or not some of these guys had actual, whether they rented space downtown or if they were going and traveling to women's homes. I think someone like Alva Vanderbilt would have had the hairdresser come to her home and do it for like special events that she, wanted a little more flair than her lady's maid could do. And then, so mostly at home, but then slowly toward later in the century, you get these early versions of salons called hair rooms or saloons. Yeah. And then women are leaving the house and they're going to get their hair done in someone else's space.
Okay, so let's go to, you mentioned true versus false earlier in this conversation. So let's talk about some true versus false. Give us your most interesting ones.
Okay, I think the biggest myth that I busted for this book was that for some reason, we love to think that women only wash their hair once a month, like once every 4 weeks. And it's true that some of the etiquette books will say, only wash your hair once every 4 weeks, only wash your hair once every 3 weeks. But what I determined was that the average was probably once every 2 weeks, which is not like so out of, hand. Like you can kind of imagine it. So I think women were washing their hair once every 2 weeks with these egg yolk shampoos, and they were doing that in the home. And you mentioned, plumbing. If they had the running water, they could rinse that shampoo out at home. If not, then they're going out to the backyard and probably just like filling a bucket and like washing that shampoo out. But I think once every 2 weeks was probably the average.
What do you think was the average for someone to actually bathe themselves?
Probably more often than we think. I think the actual like bathing, and that's gonna diverge by class as well.
Sure.
And I think there was more like sponge bathing than actual like submerging yourself in water. But there were like in a home bathtub. So high-end homes, again, like Vanderbilt Astor's, would have tubs at home, and then they're like getting, water warmed up by the maids and the butlers and filling up the bathtubs. I think for most people, for most women, it was sponge baths, and then there were also bathing houses that you could go to and get a warm bath.
How inconvenient. Okay, give us another one. Another myth that you busted.
Let me think. Okay, how about so hairdressing, the demographics in the United States are, completely like the heterogeneous, like so mixed at the time. So like I mentioned, the entrepreneurs in the hair industry are not just white women by any stretch of the imagination. You have Black and mixed race women who are creating products for their communities, but then there's also evidence in the newspapers that women like Christiana Carto-Bannister were producing products for their communities, but also turning around and selling them to white women. And I think that is just like super just fascinating. I have more research to do there, but the reason why I know this is because these women are advertising in newspapers. Newspapers are kind of segregated at the time, and these Black and mixed race entrepreneurs are advertising in in newspapers that were aimed at white audiences.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Pretty cool, right?
Yeah. Super fascinating.
Yeah.
So any others?
All right. Well, how about split ends?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Split
Okay,
ends.
so split ends were a major concern from women. So I mentioned that the ideal for white women's hair was to have it long, luxurious, and wavy. And that meant that there was not a whole lot of like hair cutting going on because they just kept growing it. So split ends were a major concern. And you would think that, especially with all of the like sewing that women did, they had tons of scissors like around the house that they would just like snip their own split ends. But I found that in truth, they were going to male barbers to get their split ends cut, or they were going to a salon or a hair room run by a woman and getting a service called hair singeing. And singeing. So like
Yes.
lighting the ends of your hair on fire and then like tamping it out really quickly just to get rid of the split ends. And this was like a service that you see on the service menus in these salons was singeing. And is that something that like resonates today?
Yeah, so good question. I was going to say that, and the listeners may remember that a number of years ago, there was a hairstylist with a decent following who posted him singeing the ends of a client's hair. And this video went wildfire, no pun intended, pun intended.
Yeah.
And of course, thousands of comments, most of which were just lambasting him for doing something dangerous and not good for the hair, and just trying to get, attention. But I think that that he was talking about it as if this was something that people used to do, and it was really interesting from an historical standpoint. He wasn't actually, I think, having this as an item on his menu that he's actually going to really do. But that it's interesting you said that because my mind jumped straight to that. No, I don't think anybody does that these days. I mean, it doesn't smell good. You've got fire in the salons. You're not supposed to have.
Not a good idea.
Not even, you're not really supposed to do all that kind of stuff. So
that's fascinating to me. Yeah. And I have to go look for that video because this singeing is just a constant service that you see offered. But then on the flip side, in the newspapers, you see these stories about accidents that happened. And so-and-so lighting their hair on fire because you had to like tamp it out pretty quickly. So all these fascinating bits that, sound kind of nuts, but then like when you get down to it, they do make sense. Or like, some of the same concerns that people had then are the same now. I mean, I'm always looking at my split ends.
Oh, totally. Okay, so do you want to hear some of the true versus false that I had in my episode?
Yes. Bring it.
Okay, let's see. Okay, true or false? Hair is the fastest growing tissue in the human body.
True?
False. It's bone marrow.
Okay.
What country has the largest population of redheaded people? That's not a true or false, obviously, but just one of the questions that I had.
I mean, I will go with Ireland.
The U.S.
It's the U.S.?
Yeah, I think basically we just have, we have lots of redheaded people from lots of other countries.
From immigration.
Other countries, right.
Yeah.
And these other countries are small. So, and the U.S. is big. So.
Okay. So, and I read that only 2% of the population, the human population, has red hair.
Let's see.
Does that sound about right?
According to Wikipedia.
Okay.
4% of the U.S. population is redheaded.
Okay.
Scotland does boast the largest density or largest proportion of redheads, which has an estimated percentage of redheads at 13.
Ooh, that's a large percentage, and it makes sense.
And let's see, I have lots of other things. Going into the history side of things, I said in the episode, an early Renaissance era hair gel recipe from around 1300 used lizard fat or tallow blended with bird droppings?
All right,
Women,
I believe the tallow part. I don't know about the bird droppings.
yeah, I don't either.
Okay.
Women conditioned their hair with dead lizards boiled in olive oil.
Oh
And
gosh, the olive oil definitely sounds right. In the
yeah.
19th century, it's all like olive oil and castor oil in these recipes.
In the 1600s, the time of Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth I, women would set their hair with lard, which makes sense, right? You got the fatty acids and stuff. The smell, and maybe this could be something that you dispel or confirm. The smell would attract rats at night, so they would sleep with nightcaps, or
I'm
in more
gonna go. Yeah, I'm gonna believe that. Sorry, I cut you off just hearing
that's okay.
the lard. Yeah.
Yeah. In more extreme cases, instead of nightcaps, they would sleep with cages over their heads to ward off the little critters.
I'm gonna say no to the cages.
I
What?
would say that sounds impossible to sleep with a cage around your head.
Yeah.
Here's one about lice. They were a major problem during the 1700s. And I was going to ask you about it with the late 19th century. But in the 1700s, supposedly, men would shave their heads and wear wigs instead because lice was such a major problem.
Yeah, I think that's true.
In the 18th century, the predominant style was for the wig to be as white as possible. If you were poor, this meant adding copious amounts of flour to the wig.
Yeah, I think talc powder was the ultimate that they wanted, that they would whiten the wigs with. And then it does sound correct that people would try whatever they could to look wealthy and aristocratic. And maybe they did drop a bunch of flour on it.
A German chemist, let's see, pause, Donovan, let me figure this out. Okay, here we go. Okay, here's a trivia question. A German chemist named what developed a water-soluble powder shampoo and sold it in his pharmacy? It was an instant hit, and he was soon taking orders from every pharmacy in Berlin, then Holland, then Russia. He followed up with the first liquid shampoo in 1927, establishing this company as the world's first hair care business empire. What
So you said it
is the
was
guy's name?
German, but I was going
Yeah.
to say L'Oreal. But
Yeah, I don't know.
okay.
And maybe it's not the first, but let's just assume the trivia question is, who was this guy and what was the company that he started very early? I
Ooh,
guess
German.
1927 is when he established it, which sounds much later than L'Oreal. So let's just assume L'Oreal's first. But what company do you think I'm talking about?
It's not.
Schwarzkopf.
Oh, yeah. Well, German name. It's like
Yes,
that should have
Hans
come directly to my head.
Schwarzkopf.
Yes. Excellent. I love it.
Well, look, this is so awesome. We're an industry that's kind of obsessed with current and future trends, and we don't nearly think about history as much as we need to. So thank you so much for writing this book. Where can people find it?
Thank you. The book is available at all major book retailers, you name it, and it's available worldwide. So I love bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores and also supports authors. It's available on Amazon worldwide, Barnes & Noble. And thank you. And further information is available on my website, elizabethlblock.com. And then I would love if you give me your feedback on the book. Listeners, on my Instagram, Elizabeth L. Block, I post some really fun hair history and fashion history videos and pictures.
Yes, and by the way, I want to mention before we wrap it up that the book has a lot of illustrations in it, right? There's a lot of pictures in there. It's not just
Yes.
it's not just writing.
Oh, yes. This is a 4-color, full printed book with more than 90 images, mostly color, of early salons, early hairstyles, paintings, beautiful miniature paintings, these beautiful photographs at the beach so that you can see how women handled their hair when it was wet outdoors on the beach. So it's fully illustrated, and that's the only way I would tell hairdressing history. I mean, we're visual people, right?
Absolutely. So cool. Thank you so much for coming on, Liz.
Thank you. This was so fun.